Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be entitled the 20 greatest prog and jazz rock albums of all time. Okay, you guys love a list, you guys love a top 10 list, don't you? That's what makes you click. You know, I can do a very philosophical conversation about the nature of progressive rock and what makes it prog and what makes a great progressive rock album. But in the end, you want to hear my top 10s, or in this case, my top 20s. Now, when I do my 10 favourite progressive rock albums, or what I think are the 10 greatest jazz rock albums, there's a little bit of an issue there, because often on, say, the progressive rock list, there's jazz rock albums that are very proggy that I don't include. And then of course you guys come in and say, why didn't you include Return to Forever on your progressive rock list, or where's Frank Zappa? And so it doesn't seem to quite represent it. So I thought what I'll do is I'll take my top 10 favourite, or what I think are the top 10 greatest progressive rock albums of all time. I'll take that list, I'll take what I think are the 10 greatest jazz rock albums, I'll put those two lists together and see what I get, and I get a top 20. And then when I was going through it, I thought, you know, even though I do think that this album is the greatest album by that band, this one is my favourite album. And in this case, I'm going to make a case on this list for my favourite album. So this list is a little less objective than my other lists. This is really my sort of 20 favourite jazz rock and prog albums. Also, in doing this channel, and all you lovely viewers with all your suggestions, me asking, you know, what do you think of this band? Sometimes I'll go back and reevaluate a band and think, oh my God, they're so much better than I thought they were. Or I get introduced to new albums that I haven't heard, or I get reintroduced to albums that I heard when I was young and I didn't get, and now I get them. And so there's a few new additions on here, and there's definitely two albums on one on the fusion side and one on the prog side, which I think would now make my top 10 lists if I was redoing them. And I think this summer I probably will redo the 10 greatest lists. And so this is a little bit of a preamble to that. As you can see, my opinions changing, right? And that's what it's all about. You know, music is not objective and it's not subjective. It's somewhere in the middle, and that's what makes it fascinating. And the reason why it's not entirely subjective is because when you watch this, there's going to be things that ring true with you, and you'll go, yeah, Andy's right there. That's right, because we are talking about certain things. You know, when I say I think Close to the Edge is one of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time, that's a pretty objective statement. It's not just flat out subjective. Most people are going to agree with that, right? But on the other side, there are variations and changes, and that's what makes this very interesting. So please, you know, when you come to put the comments, I love when people say, you know, I love this album, I would have that in my top 10. But remember, this is only my choices, right? And my claim at absolute objectivity, I'm not claiming that. But I'm not claiming that this is just my favourites. There's somewhere in between. So hopefully we've got what I would describe as Andy's 20 greatest jazz rock and prog albums of all time. That would be the best title. Now, before we start, another mention is that Miles Davis didn't make this list, right? And the reason I didn't put Miles on the list is because I don't think he's really prog, and I don't think he's really jazz rock. I think he's in his own category. He's beyond category, Miles is. And so I've surreptitiously got him into the video. The eagle-eyed of you will have probably noticed. Right, so shall we just crack on? So, at number 10, at number 20, I'm so used to doing a top 10. Right, so at number 20, I have Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. You know, undeniably one of the greatest albums ever made, not just in the prog genre, in all genres. This is a monumental album. And the power of this album is the fact that it's able to take actually quite challenging, quite depressing subject matter, which is presented in a very, very proggy way, in a sort of conceptual, ever-evolving, cascading way, and present it to the general public in a way which does not compromise and yet has reached millions and millions and millions of people. Okay. Now, in terms of Pink Floyd's, mainstream progressive period, which I think sort of starts with Dark Side of the Moon and encompasses Wish You Were Here and The Wall, there's a strong argument that their proggiest moment of that would be Animals, and I nearly wanted to put Animals on the list, but to me, I'm denying a certain attribute that this album has of unmitigated greatness. And in doing this channel, my belief in the greatness of Pink Floyd has just gone up and up and up. Pink Floyd are a little bit mainstream for my ears, I suppose. I'm not a super huge fan of Dave Gilmour's beautiful guitar solos. I do like them, and there's a lot of music that I dislike more than that. It's not something I hate. I do really like Gilmour's moments, but it's not, I'm a Mavish and Orchestra fan in the end. I want to hear Blood and Rage, but very beautiful as they are. But I feel that there's something else that makes Pink Floyd great in this period, and it's that conceptual idea and the exposition and explanation of that sort of existential angst, which is actually a slightly different subject matter than most prog. Most prog can dwell with the fairies and dwell with the sort of mystical guru end of the world and the sword and sorcery thing. Pink Floyd's subject matter is really rooted in our existence on the planet. It's existential. I think that's the way to describe it, and I think that's captured brilliantly on this album. It's a fantastic conglomeration of beautiful band playing, incredible guitar solos, spoken word, music concrete, synthesis, incredible soul vocals, expansive compositions with incredible arrangements that just seem to be bigger than the sum of its parts. It is a truly great album. So that's what I've got at number 20 is Dark Side of the Moon. So you can see where we're starting, one of the greatest albums ever made. At number 19 is a new entry for me in terms of progressive rock. And it's the album from, I think, 1972 by the Italian prog rock band PFM. And it's called Per un Amico. Recently, because there's been an accusation that I don't cover enough European progressive rock bands on this channel, so I did a big re-evaluation. I listened to all these bands again, and I went through a lot of the albums that I'd listened to many years before and revisited them. Going back to this album, I was absolutely blown away. I think within the prog world, there are a couple of bands that really deliver compositionally, that are able to really create incredibly dense, rich compositions that are equal in their density and creative, their creative vision to classical music, which is what progressive rock's trying to do. I think a lot of the more famous prog bands are brilliant, but often when you look at their classical influence in the arrangement, it's a little bit clunky, and that's part of the charm for it. A band that's really can, for me, create incredible compositions that are equal to classical compositions would be a band like Gentle Giant. Obviously Frank Zappa's able to do it. I think Jethro Tull on A Passion Play do it. These incredibly dense orchestrated albums. Well, for me in 1972, right, leading the way, right, is PFM with this album. It's monumental in its breadth and its arrangement. The rock band playing's incredible. The sort of symphonic touches are beautiful. The integration of synthesis is absolutely incredible. The integration of flute and violin into that rock band sound are absolutely brilliant. It's equal or beyond possibly any progressive rock band and what they're doing in 1972, and that's saying something. Yes, Close to the Edge is an incredible album, but in terms of actual technical mastery, this album is unbelievable. If you don't know it, go and check it out. If you're a progressive rock band, check it out. And that's my new entry. I think next time I do my 10 favourite progressive rock albums, Pear and Alnico by PFM will be in there, and I can feel happy in the knowledge that I am championing the best of European progressive rock, which is something I am aware that I sometimes miss. So that's who I've got at number 19. At number 18 is another new entry on the jazz rock side, and it's Exhibition by John Serry Jr., an album that I've sort of discovered over the last couple of years doing this channel. I was so impressed once I got in. There's actually 2 albums by John Serry. There's this Exhibition, and then the following year, in I think 1980-81, he made an album called Jazz Is. Both of them are absolutely fantastic. The Exhibition one pips to the post because it has a little bit more of that drier 70s jazz rock sound that I really like. This album is somewhere between fusion. Fusion being that style that emerged later in the 1970s, the more funkier, commercial, accessible sound. You know, when jazz musicians were trying to hold on to their record deal by trying to write a hit record that could be played out in dance clubs and on the radio. And they were all trying to do it. There's a certain sound that goes with that I've been quite critical on this channel. John Serry, who's a pianist but is also a trained percussionist, writes in that style, right? It's if you want to know what it sounds like, it's somewhere between Frank Zappa and the Brecker brothers. It's extremely funky, it's accessible, but it's also incredibly dense, and the composition is absolutely unbelievable. The musicianship is just jaw-dropping, especially the late great Carlos Vega on drums, that, you know, puts down one of the greatest drum performances in the history of jazz rock as far as I'm concerned. This is an absolute masterpiece in terms of jazz rock. And in terms of prog, it's denser than so many progressive rock albums. Here we have at 19 and 18, 2 albums that really, you know, are just so incredible if you're into detailed, virtuoso, dense, you know, musicianship, which of course I am, but also doesn't sacrifice musicality for that. These are brilliant albums. So that's what I've got at number 18, is Exhibition by John Serry Jr. I won't go on about it too much because up here is now a link to a whole video where I discuss it, so you can go over there if I've piqued your interest with that. At number 17 is a progressive rock album which verges towards jazz rock, I think. When I do my top 10 lists, it gets brought up over and over again. It's one of my favourite progressive rock albums. It's a masterpiece, and it is the self-titled album by UK, the progressive rock supergroup that came formed in 77-78, I think, with Eddie Jobson on violin and keyboards, Bill Bruford on drums, John Wetton on bass and vocals, and of course the incredible Alan Holdsworth on guitar. When I do a list like this, Holdsworth's got to be on there, and it's so many albums you could pick from. And this album is an incredible progressive rock album, but it's also very representative of Holdsworth, so I have to have him on the list. I could have equally put on One of a Kind by Bruford as well. Both of those albums vie. And for me, when I do those lists, because of that, I often just take them out lists. But I thought, I know so many people are going to come along and say, you know, where's UK on the list? And I think, you know, in this case, I have now added them to my list. They're in there. They're in one of those magic albums that I think are up in the greats. Is the UK debut album. It'd be interesting if you go back and have a look at my list to see what's gone. You know. And in my revamped video on my 10 favourite progressive rock albums, I've sort of hinted at the ones I thought were going to go. So this is quite interesting here. So yeah, at number 17, I've got the debut album from UK, an absolutely incredible album. One of the things in that album that's always struck me is how great would I think it is if Holdsworth was removed. And I think the compositions are incredibly strong, and we could sort of imagine what that's like because of the follow-up album, Danger Money. Now, in terms of the songwriting, I, as a youngster, really loved the compositions on Danger Money and would go to that album as an example of UK. I don't know whether I was just overawed by Holdsworth's solos, that just stops me from really taking in the beauty of the compositions. More recently, revisiting because viewers, nearly called you students then, sorry, because viewers of this channel have suggested, UK, and I've gone back and listened to it again. And I think the compositions are so strong, and even taking Holdsworth out of it, which is very difficult because he's so integral to this album, I think the compositions are great. Holdsworth's a difficult one for many people. I think for the casual listener, this is the place to go to hear Holdsworth because he's so integrated so well into these compositions. I think prog fans that find, endless, jazz improvisations a little bit wearing, this is the place where you really see Holdsworth sound well integrated into an orchestrated band. Yeah. So that's what I've got at number 17, is UK. At number 16, I have got by Gentle Giant, In a Glass House. Gentle Giant emerged in 1970 with their debut album Gentle Giant, and then they went on every year to release an absolute masterpiece. What I find so fascinating with Gentle Giant is just trying to work out which one the best one is. For most other bands, if you take Led Zeppelin and say, well, I really like Led Zeppelin 4, well, I like Physical Graffiti. Well, that's about it. Most people are going to go between those two albums. Oh, I'm a Led Zeppelin 3. But it's a different argument. With Gentle Giant, when you talk about them, it's almost like everybody in the comments is going to put a different favourite album up. In doing this channel, I've gone and revisited Interview, and Interview is up there with some of the most incredible virtuoso playing of their career, and they seem to just have it nailed. Interview, who talks about Interview, so there's so many incredible albums. So a few weeks ago, I brought in the Progmeister, a friend of mine called Steve Gould, who is very knowledgeable, and we really thrashed it out. And I think we came to the conclusion, which is something like this. He felt that he thought Three Friends was the greatest. I thought In a Glass House was the greatest. Objectively standing back, it could well be Octopus, but are we being swayed by the incredible Roger Dean cover? So that's where we got, I think, really considering it. My favourite's Freehand, because it's the first one I heard. But I think objectively and in proggy terms, In a Glass House is their finest moment by a tiny amount. So that's what we've got at number 16. If you want to, explore this more, then, sorry, I never get this right, there is a link to that video where we have a whole massive one video on Gentle Giant trying to thrash this out. Right, at number 15, I have the album You by Gong. This really divides people. Some people come on and say, this is the greatest prog album ever, you're totally right. And then people will say, your list's great, but I would ditch Gong, right? I think I really love a lot of the Canterbury bands. I love Hatfield and the North. I like National Health. Caravan, incredible. I know you're going to mention all those albums. Absolutely love them. My favourite Canterbury album is The Rotters Club by Hatfield and the North, and the Sidelong Mumps is just jaw-dropping. Gong are not quite a Canterbury band, but those influences are in there. Those sort of twee, lovely English, eccentric, light and fluffy prog. Gong do very well, but they're a lot more than that. They have that also, that sort of French European thing going on, and of course David Allen, the genius behind it, was Australian, and so it's a sound all of its own. Okay, and that's why I argue for it. It's an incredible sound. It cannot be explained. Prog fans, right? You prog fans that aren't so knowledgeable of modern, house dance music, right? You cannot explain the influence of this album and this band at this time on that scene. Okay, the influence in England when dance music came to the UK, and it it sort of melded with the sort of New Age Travellers and the rave thing, and it became very hippified. The dance producers, you know, people like The Orb, Future Sound London, they embrace this sound from Gong. The influence is absolutely huge, and that's what just tips this album over for me. And even when I put it on now, whereas a lot of progressive rock is incredible, but you can hear its root in the 70s, this album doesn't sound like that. It still sounds fresh to me. Now, those who want detailed progressive rock might find the long, trancy jams on this album not to their taste, and I understand that. But there is something about this album which is absolutely unique. It's full on prog. I mean, this is the part 3 of that triptych of albums that starts with Radio Gnome Invisible, and then you get Angel's Egg, and then you get You, and that is a real achievement. This isn't one epic. This is 3 epic, you know, masterpieces made over a number of years, and that this album holds itself together for all the trippiness and drugginess that's in, you know, that's in this record. If you start off, you know, with Radio Gnome on the first album and just follow the story through, bizarre and trippy as it is, the whole thing works together and it builds towards this incredible climax, which is this album You. It's an absolute monumental masterpiece for me. Sorry, it just is. I come back to it over and over again. I put it on again. You know, I'm always thinking, why people haven't, you know, dig at this album? I put it on and my jaw always hits the floor. Absolutely every single time. It's an absolute masterpiece. One of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. So that's what I've got at number 15. Right. At number 14, I have Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. Jazz rock emerges 1970. It's a fusion of sort of progressive rock styles, and I mean progressive in the wider term. This idea of rock music has suddenly opens its arms to the world and it's embracing absolutely everything. The experimentation is the trendy thing to do, right? That's what's happening. And you got this heavy psychedelic album orientated music that's coming out and taking over the world. And jazz mixes with that and you get jazz rock. And jazz rock is hard and hitting, and at this point it's hard to differentiate between that and prog. At some point jazz rock splits and it gets funky, okay? And I love the funk, and for me the heaviest funk is jazz rock being funky, whether it's Weather Report, whether it's Billy Cobham, and right at the pinnacle it's Herbie Hancock, that great jazz virtuoso pianist that would have gone down in history just for what he did in the Miles Davis Quintet in the 60s. This is one of the greatest jazz keyboardists. We know that, one of the greatest acoustic jazz keyboardists that has emerged in the last 60 years. But my God, is this guy funky. He's not just a jazz virtuoso. Herbie Hancock understands a pop hook, and he moves over from an actually very esoteric type of electric jazz that he, you know, explored with the Mawandishi band. You know, after a tour with the Pointer Sisters, he decides, let's pull it in, let's see if we can, you know, reach more people. And he does this in a way which never compromises the creativity. And that's the actual masterpiece of this album, Headhunters, is there is improvisation of the highest order, there is playing of the highest order, it's beautifully composed, it's beautifully recorded, and yet we have some incredible hooks, which of course at the peak is don 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 don. This is rare. So many jazz musicians go down the rabbit hole of trying to become accessible, but these guys that don't understand a hook, right? Herbie Hancock does. You want another one? Incredible stuff. So that's what I got at number 14. Is Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. What a list! These are the early albums you need. Get rid of the rest. Just have these 20. This is it. Right, number 13. Okay, I've got a Genesis album. Right now, Genesis. I keep changing my opinion of what I think the greatest Genesis album is. For most prog fans, they're going to like Selling England by the Pound. Right, that's what most prog fans like. I'm not a massive fan of that album. I think it meanders and there's some weak tracks on there. Foxtrot, Suburbs Ready is their finest hour, isn't it? but side 1, it's okay, it's good, it's got some good stuff on there, right? But not as good as side 2, not as good as Supper's Ready. Nursery Crime, it's all in embryo, isn't it? It's all in embryo at that point, and but it was the sort of, my first Genesis album was actually 3 Sides Live, and I heard that mixture of the sort of more poppier Genesis and the more prog, and I love both, right? People who really know Genesis, and when they want to really talk about, you know, beautifully recorded, beautifully composed, orchestrated progressive rock at its finest, it could well be Trick of the Tail, right? It's a bit like the Gentle Giant conundrum, right? But if I was just going to grab one album and stick it under my arm, it would be Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which does meander and doesn't fully, for me, represent that quirky English sound which Genesis are so well known for. It is there, it's there, but it's not there in as much as it is on albums like Nursery Crime and Foxtrot and Selling England by the Pound. It's got an American influence, but for me, I think, just to be obtuse, every time I pick a favourite Genesis album, it's going to be different. I think I've so far I've picked Foxtrot, I've picked Nursery Crime. On another video I've said that Trick of the Tail probably is their greatest if you're really objective about it. And here I am in my 20 greatest albums of all time, because this is pretty much what it is, picking Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, you know, which I think in the end, my favourite bits of proggy Genesis are on that album. It's beautifully recorded, it's expansive, it's them at their most extravagant. And so, God, I mean, what do you come for? You come for me having an opinion right now today, and that's the problem with so many of these great bands, is that if they're great because our favourite albums can shift and change, can't they? You can go back and listen. At the moment, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. That's the one for me in terms of Genesis. I'm going to stick with that for a while. Okay, this one doesn't budge though. This number 12, this doesn't budge. It's my favourite album by this band, and I've never wavered off that. So at number 12, I have that album that's slapped between progressive rock and jazz rock, Romantic Warrior. I've always said that Romantic Warrior by Chick Corea and Return to Forever is the greatest instrumental progressive rock album of all time. If you don't include maybe Tubular Bells, and maybe there's a couple of Tangerine Dream albums. Oh God, you know, these lists are silly. And Romantic Warrior is a masterpiece. For progressive rock fans that don't listen to jazz rock, and they've never gone down the Return to Forever Mavish Knox route, they've never gone down there. You know, if you've got a friend who's like that, sit them down and put Romantic Warrior, because what we have here is really true virtuosos, because however you split it, what makes a progressive rock instrumentalist great is their individuality. People like Bruford, Rick Wakeman, Keith Emerson, Steve Howe, Robert Fripp, the virtuosity is in their individuality, in sheer technical brilliance, you know, muscle power. It's the fusion, guys, for me, right? So when you get 4 incredibly charismatic individual jazz rock guys making a progressive rock album, which is what you've got with Romantic Warrior, when you've got Chick Corea on keyboards, when you've got Stanley Clarke on bass, Lenny White on drums, and Aldi Meola on guitar, what you have is this monumental masterpiece. Yes, Romantic Warrior is kitsch. It's designed to be. It's kitsch. It's there's parts where it's quite comedic. It's light. It's entertaining. It's fun. You know, it's got a tune called The Jewel of the Jester and the Tyrant, which is surely as much poking fun at pompous progressive rock ideas. But the thing is, Chick Corea is a brilliant composer, and these classical motifs he's an absolute master of, and that's what it's exploring. It's exploring it for me in an almost tongue-in-cheek way, but it's so musically brilliant that at no point do you feel like it's a satire. It's truly amazing and bombastic, and they know it. It's absolutely brilliant. And so that's what I've got at number 12 is Romantic Warrior. At number 11 is another contentious choice for you lot. You know, it's Moving Pictures by Rush. That's what I've got at number 11. And I've rated Moving Pictures higher than Romantic Warrior, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Headhunters. You know who I am. You know how much I love these albums. Moving Pictures for me is just a perfect album. Beautiful. Perfection. An incredible realisation of progressive rock relating to the changes that are happening in music at that time. An absolutely perfect integration where other bands are looking at the 80s and are trying to wind themselves in a little bit to what's going on. And yes, they're going to do 90125 and Genesis are going to make Abacab. You know, that moment in time when progressive rock bands are trying to wind themselves in. Rush wind themselves in, but in a way that utterly doesn't compromise, right? And so above all the albums, above Hemispheres, above Farewell to Kings or 2112, the albums that are so-called more proggy, right? Those proggy albums for me, artistically, are slightly hobbled by their progginess. They are a little bit juvenile, okay? Sorry, they are a little bit. I love them and they're brilliant. But this band grows up, right? They say a farewell to Kings. They say a farewell to songs about Rivendell and fairies and Lord of the Rings. They know that they're not able to do that, and they create a progressive rock album that intellectually is so much more advanced than those earlier albums. And they're able to take the epicness, the virtuosity of progressive rock, and in some cases boil it down to a song like Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer is like a prog epic. Right, and every single step they make is perfect, absolutely perfect. There's never a wrong step in any of it, to such an extent that, like Dark Side of the Moon, it travels into mainstream culture. Don't you think that Rush, for all the non-prog records that they make later on, for all the concessions to commerciality, are most known for Tom Sawyer, which is time signature, you know, it abounds in time signatures, it abounds in literary references, it abounds in virtuoso playing and incredible drum fills and all that stuff that's in there, and twists and changes. Got about 15 parts. Incredible. We have possibly the greatest prog instrumental of all time, which is YYZ. We have the huge camera eye on side 2. We have the unadulterated full-on progressive rock of Witch Hunt, followed up by the new wave brilliance of Vital Signs. This is an absolute masterpiece. And people who, those dyed-in-the-wool prog fans that are like the gatekeepers of prog, the ones that are going to squeeze it right down and go, we're not letting anything in but this, it's going to sound like 70s progressive rock. I'm sorry, I can't get that tied down. I'm not that anal retentive, right? I'm not that anal retentive. I've got to open my arms up for Moving Pictures, sorry. And again, there's a whole video on this where I really have a go. And if you want to laugh, right, and you want to see, you know, what I think of that anal retard end of the progressive rock world and how damaging it is to creativity, then yeah, go and check that link out there. And, you know, check out a whole video where I've discussed this. It's still there, 11 Moving Pictures. Right. At number 10, I have one of the greatest albums ever made. You know, it's definitely a prog album through and through. It's probably one of the most proggiest albums on this list. It's also the most punkiest album on this list. It rivals Frank Zappa in its compositional density, right? It rivals the Inner Mountain Flame in its rocky, dirty, in-your-face playing. It rivals Genesis for its quirky Englishness. It is, of course, the incredible Cardiacs and the album Sing to God, the double album masterpiece, right? Which literally pummels you with so much brilliance, okay? And of course, with Cardiacs, I could swap out many other albums for this as well. But for me, I think it's Sing to God because I'm not going to say that. I was going to say it contains Dirty Boy, which I think is one of the greatest songs ever made. But go and search around Cardiacs. Now, a lot of people don't know Cardiacs. I'm really championing them on this channel at the moment. And I'm not going to say much more about them, because I've made contact with the incredible bass playing guitarist John Paul, who actually was not only involved in the playing on this album, but was involved in the writing. And we made contact, and in a week or so we're going to hook up, and there's going to be a whole video, hopefully, if it all comes off. I can't promise anything, but I'm hopefully going to get the inside story on this incredible band and this incredible album by John Paul. So I'm not going to say any more than that. But here it is at number 10 is Sing to God. Anyone who's watching my channel has realised the Cardiacs are taking over. It's an endless search. There's so much stuff out there. This band they made basically sort of 7 albums. A couple of those are sort of edited from outtakes and compilations. But then there's a whole massive world out there of other albums, and it's just, I cannot get to the back end of Cardiacs. I listen to them all the time at the moment, and it's one masterpiece after the other. It's one whole world after the other, and I just cannot get my hands on this incredible band. I cannot get conceptual. I find it really difficult to talk about them in any way at all. I wish I could come out with album titles and track titles and names, but for me, every time I listen to them, it's an absolutely overwhelming experience. And so they're going to become a main band for this channel. I'm sure you're turning around saying, have you only just discovered the Cardiacs? No, I discovered them in 2005. That's when I first listened to them, and I thought they were a very interesting band. It's a world, and the deeper you go into that world, the more you realise it's not just quirky, weird, complex music. There's so much more than that. And the conceptual, the concept behind these albums and what they point to artistically is something very, very heavy. I talk a lot about the English aesthetic on this channel and how important that is, not only to progressive rock, but to rock music itself. If you were to distill what that is, it's Cardiacs. I'm moving on. So, what are we on to next? Okay, so we're at number 9. This is going to be a long video. I'll just check the time. It's 40 minutes or 37 minutes at the moment. So what have we got at number 9? We have the incredible Black Market by Weather Report. What an album. Weather Report they're in 3 parts to me. They start off as this sort of post-British brew electric jazz group, very spacey, very tasteful. Anyone who classes themselves as having taste and being erudite will always mention the first album as being the great album. I don't think that's the case. I think that what they do on the first album's in embryo, it's very interesting. They actually take it and run with it. I Sing the Body Electric is just, it's the first album times 10, right? Then you get to Sweet Nighter, and Sweet Nighter, they change, right? And they discovered this sort of funky approach, which back then is quite chaotic, it's quite esoteric, but God, it's funky. Almost a companion to what Miles is doing at that time with albums like the one behind me, Agata, and Big Fun, this sort of incredible take on African influences and funk influences and sort of tribal influences. Sweet Night is a monumental album. Then their compositional style for me kicks in on Mysterious Traveller. That's them becoming one of the great jazz rock bands, Mysterious Traveller. And then in terms of a blowing album, Tail Spinning is the underrated masterpiece. They're moving towards something which is artistically and musically very high in its conception, but is also very accessible. There's a big journey from quite inaccessible music to very accessible, which we have on Heavy Weather. And Heavy Weather is an absolute masterpiece. I think the band's a little hobbled by the success of that, and they're trying to chase that success. Mr. Gone is not so successful for me. Even the 8:30, the live album that people like, I don't think is as strong as other live recordings I've heard a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Eventually on Night Passage, that second phase, they seem to get to their stride. So the two great albums by the sort of second, the Jaco Pastorius band, the classic one, from which now there is only Peter Erskine left. I realised the other day with Wayne Shorter dying recently. Night Passage is the masterpiece, and then they reformed into what I call the Omar Hakim band, and that is very underrated. People tend to think that wasn't as great as the early stuff, which I think it's actually, there's some real riches there, especially on the albums Procession, Domino Theory and Tail Spinning. I love those albums. Just before they make this incredible breakthrough with Heavy Weather, which is very similar to what Herbie does with Headhunters, the album For That Black Market, all those things seem to come together. We see the emergence of Jaco Pastorius' voice, but we've also got Alfonso's incredible driving bass lines. We've got Chester Thompson, which this is the only real album that Chester's on, and he was actually a very important player, and there's some incredible drumming on that. We've also got my hero, Narada Michael Walden, coming in, playing on 2 tracks, and they're the best Weather Report tracks. Sorry everybody, it's the Narada touch, the magical touch. My favourite track by Weather Report is probably Black Market. I love it. Chester and Narada together. And when Narada kicks in on that, bloody hell, that's my favourite moment. And Wayne's just burning. He's so funky. For a guy that's come out of free jazz, Art Blakey band, Time No Changes Miles. And then you listen to him at the end of Black Market in that solos. King Curtis, he's just funky. They're just amazing. It's just an incredible album. That's what I've got anyway at number 9. How many times have I spoken about this album on this channel? That never changes. My favourite Weather Report album is Black Market. It will never change. And my favourite at number 8, I don't know actually. At number 8, I've got Red by King Crimson. I get it in the neck here for not championing In the Court of the Crimson King. That's where it all started, Andy, In the Court of the Crimson King. Yeah, it is. And 21st Century Schizoid Man is just sublime brilliance. For me, that first album, once you get past that, it's all a little bit of an anticlimax to me. There's some great moments, but even those great moments are sort of quite turgid, plodding, mellotron prog. And I know it's the first time it's been done. It's a sound that's going to be taken up by sort of Van der Graaf generator, and I find that boring as well. I find that first album a little bit boring. Not Schizoid Man, that's brilliant. That's got everything on it. It's even got the embryos of jazz rock as well on there. It's an incredible achievement. For me, King Crimson become the massive creative force in progressive rock with the Bill Bruford Band in 1972, with Lark Songs Aspic, Starless and the Bible Black and Red. Those 3 albums, and I'd even include USA in that, the live album. Those 3 albums are just they're all masterpieces. And the truth is, I always pick Red, right? Because I think the Red's brilliant in that there's 2 things going on. There's this very proggy, orchestrated King Crimson that we hear on Lark's Tongues in Aspic, very proggy. And then there's this wild rock improvising band that we hear on Starless in the Bible Black. If you take those 2 things and put them together, it all comes together in what is a very concise album actually, which is Red. And I think it's the concision of that album that makes it so great. Whereas on other albums, the brilliance is there, but you have to go on the journey of the album to pull it all together, Red is just there. That heavy, dark, almost heavy metal riffing, which is somewhere between Black Sabbath and Bela Bartok. That's that sound there, There's some brilliant improvisation. There's the incredible jazz rock stuff, and Starless is one of the great prog epics. It really is. But with the opening track Red, that's one of the great concise riffy prog tracks. It just does everything. And so if I just wanted to grab one album that does what that Mark II King Crimson does, if it's Mark II or Mark III, it would be Red. I've spoken about it so many times that it's really hard to say much more. But that's what I've got at number 9. At number 8, sorry, that's what I've got at number 8, isn't it? We're on number 7 now. At number 7, I have one of the greatest albums ever made. This is like really, it's for me personally, if I was grabbing probably 3 albums, this might be one of those albums. On my jazz rock list, I put on Oh Yeah by Jan Hammer. It's an absolute masterpiece. A lot of people questioned it because I knew they hadn't listened to it. For me, it's one of the most burning, over-the-top post-Mavish new albums ever. Jan Hammer is the defining sound of fusion. He's a defining sound within the Mavish Nuksha. That Moog lead is to jazz rock what Charlie Parker's sound is to bebop, to me. And I've done a video which is entitled Jan Hammer, the Charlie Parker of jazz rock. After he made Oh Yeah, I think in 1977, he made an album of songs, right? He took his jazz rock group, he didn't get a singer in, they decided to split the vocals up between them, and he wrote an album of very sort of commercial pop songs called Melodies. It should be a disaster, and it's not. It's a work of utter genius. And those of you who want your jazz rock, dose, they deliver over and over again on this album. But it's an album of absolute beauty, and it really shows Jan's genius as a producer. Melodies is one of the greatest albums ever made, in my opinion. When I teach production at my college, I play on this album because to me, it's the combination of incredible compositions, incredible vocal ideas of vocal hooks, incredible playing, really interesting use of synthesis, and an incredible use of the recording studio. It's an absolute masterpiece, and it's almost like going to college to learn how a studio works when you put on that album. He does things in the production which are absolutely incredible. There's a track called Peaceful Sundown, and it starts off very low and very, very laid back, and if you listen to it, everything's just happening in a sort of dull part of the stereo spectrum. It's just sat down here, right, and the whole track chucks along, and for some reason, even though it's all just over here on the one side, it sounds beautiful. It's just there, it's just sat there. And then when the keyboard comes in, another drum kit comes in, and the production seems to open up. He's saved up this sort of opening. It's stuff that you just never hear on records. Absolutely incredible. That's what I've got at number 7 is Melodies. At number 6, and this came in at number 1 on my progressive rock list, and it's made number 6, is Close to the Edge by Yes, which is possibly the greatest progressive rock album of all time, and no one seems to argue with that. So many comments on my channel will go, yeah, Close to the Edge, greatest, yeah, that's it, you got it right, without a doubt. What's interesting, I'm going to talk about, because I've spoken about Close to the Edge so often, is that I have put together a list of my favourite progressive rock albums and my favourite jazz rock albums. And here at number 6 is the last inclusion of a truly progressive rock album. All 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 now are going to be jazz rock albums. What this shows you is, when push comes to shove, your presenter on this channel loves jazz rock just a little bit more than progressive rock. Now, that idea has been in my mind a lot, because actually in doing this channel, I find myself moving from a position where I go, I really love prog, but I really love jazz rock more, which is where I would have started. When you look at this channel, it all starts to be about jazz rock, and the prog has slowly crept in. And as time has gone on, I'm now starting to see the artistic worth of these progressive rock albums is moving up, as I'm starting to see really what they achieved artistically against some of the jazz rock albums. You go, well, that's great, but it is just a bunch of funky riffs and people soloing. Soloing's good, but it's actually quite derivative, and there's a lot of these albums I love, but it is just that. And I think my love of jazz rock can sometimes I can really just go, I just love that album, because it's a burning album, but is it as innovative as one of the progressive rock albums? Doing this list here, this is interesting, because I've rated 5 albums above Close to the Edge. And these 5 albums are like my 5 favourite albums. And that's what we've got there. The next 5 albums are almost like the albums that made me, I would say. So I'm sure people are going to go, I can't believe you've done the 10 greatest progressive rock and jazz rock albums and got Close to Edge at number 6 and then got these albums as being greater. But this is where this list is personal, because at number 5 I have got, by Billy Cobham, Crosswinds. Yes, not even Spectrum. I've got Crosswinds at number 5. Crosswinds is a greater album than Spectrum. It's the Cobham's drumming is even more incredible. His drum sound is even more beautiful. The compositions are absolutely unbelievable, and the sidelong suite, which describes this sort of weather conditions and this storm passing through and then a flash flood, that whole sidelong is so immensely proggy and so immensely jazz rocky. I've got to have Michael Brecker on this list. Michael Brecker is one of the greatest soloists that's emerged in the last 60 years, and his saxophone solos on Pleasant Pheasant and Heather, which are completely different, are just 2 of the greatest solos of all time. When I was a kid and I first got into music and I was obsessed by Whitesnake and Rainbow and Tigers of Pantang and Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and I was coming through that route, I went through my dad's record collection, and in there was an album by Billy Cobham called Crosswinds, and I used to listen to it all the time, and I didn't understand it. There's a track on here in 1716, and I knew he was up to something that was way beyond anything that the rock bands or even the prog bands that I were listening to at that time was doing. This was something else, and my exploration into this album made me as a musician. It's a very, very important album for me. Okay. Number 4 is another incredibly important album for me, and it's really whizzed up the rankings. It's Wired by Jeff Beck. I think Jeff Beck we've all took for granted. His sudden death, earlier in January this year, made everyone sit up, and so you pull out Wired, and you go and listen to the guitar solo on Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, and you're like, oh my God, this is absolute genius. When I was a kid again, I'd got Crosswinds. My dad had Crosswinds, and he had a couple of other jazz rockish albums that I'm going to talk about on some upcoming videos. Quite some interesting stories there. But I was coming in from the rock side, and there was one guitarist that got mentioned a lot as being one of the great rock guitarists. Not Richie Blackmore, not Eric Clapton, not Jimi Hendrix. It was Jeff Beck. So I'd read in my rock magazines about Jeff Beck, so I thought, well, I'm going to go and buy a Jeff Beck album. So I went downtown and I bought Wired. And you've got to understand that there's certain music that means so much to me. The Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin, Narada Michael Walden, Jan Hammer. There's a certain sound there that when I heard it, I knew I'd found the thing I was looking for. For me, that happened when I first put on Wired, probably back in around about 1981, 1982, and I first heard Lead Boots. That sound, that incredible introductory drum beat by Narada, and then when it kicks in and the sort of guitar riff with the Moog synthesizer, the incredible clavinets, that funky sound, that heavy rock sound, it sounded like Led Zeppelin but times a million to me. And then going deeper into that album, Narada's drumming on Sophie and Narada's drumming on Play With Me. As a kid growing up, without Cobham on Crosswinds and Narada Michael Walden on Wired, I wouldn't be here talking to you now. I'd probably be some guy with a normal job that listened to a little bit of Led Zeppelin and played in a few covers bands. Right? That was my college. That was what made me as a musician. It really is. It's these 2 albums. That's why they score so high. Is this subjective? Of course it is. This is my list. For me, I love Close to the Edge. It's a brilliant album. But Crosswinds and Wired at 5 and 4 are masterpieces. And I don't know where I'd be without those albums. At number 3, I have an artist that never features on my greatest jazz rock lists. He never features on my prog list, and I'm always asked why he's not on, and I always say because he's big. It's a bit like the same argument as Miles, but this guy does make jazz rock, and he does make fusion. It is, of course, the genius Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is one of the most important artists in my development. There's basically 4 artists that I think are the sort of cornerstone artists, and that would be Miles, John Coltrane, Frank Zappa, and John McLaughlin, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And encompassed in that is a number of musicians. So there's a number of musicians associated with Miles that are very important to me. People like Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter, Joe Zawinul, all those guys are sort of the world, Miles Davis world. The Coltrane world would be Elvin Jones, which is a huge influence on me. McCoy Tyner's chordal approach to harmony. But also all that spiritual jazz that comes out of it, like Alice Coltrane, Pharaoh Saunders, which takes you towards people like Bill Laswell, and that whole world is all encompassed for me in Coltrane. Also moving towards Indian music, trance music, free jazz, that's all there with Coltrane. Miles Davis, Tony, I've just done that one. So John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu, Narada Michael Walden, Billy Cobham, all that's there. Frank Zappa is another world for me that encompasses all this approach. And it's almost like, for me, there's 2 very spiritual approaches to music, which is encompassed by Coltrane and John McLaughlin. And then there's this earthy, realistic, materialist way of approaching music, which is equally spiritual, but spiritual in a yin, as opposed, it's the yin to that sort of high spiritual, way of making music. I'm getting myself into a knot here. How can I explain this? There is an earthy, materialist, street beauty about certain styles of music, which is really rooted in real life and in normality, in the way normal people see the world. And it's like, it's the view from the street, it's the view from the regular Joe in a way. And those are encompassed by Miles Davis and Frank Zappa for me. And inside both of those is that little spot that you get in the yin and yang of spirituality. It's really deep in there. That's very important to me, because I do see myself as a spiritual person, but I see myself as a spiritual person within these materialist limits. I think I exist in that world, and so I have sort of a political, moral view of the world that's been very influenced by Miles and Frank Zappa. Then there's a high spiritual connection with something other, perhaps the infinite, and that's represented by Coltrane and John McLaughlin. And because of that, Miles isn't on this list, Coltrane's not on this list, but John McLaughlin's on this list, and we haven't had him yet, so you probably guess what's at number 1. And I'm afraid at number 2, it's my list. But at number 3, I have Frank Zappa, and the album, without a doubt, with all those brilliant albums. Zappa made so many brilliant albums, but he made one calling card album. That one album that if anybody wants to come along and what's Frank Zappa about, they can go and pick up the album One Size Fits All. It's in the title, right? It does everything that Frank does, with perhaps his greatest band, the band that had, George Duke and Chester Thompson and Napoleon Murphy Brock. That's an incredible band, and they made a number of really incredible albums. You could easily have Overnight Cessation here, you could easily have Apostrophe here, you could really have the Roxy and Elsewhere, and I nearly put the Roxy and Elsewhere on, but it's a live album, which is sort of half live, half studio, isn't it? It's One Size Fits All. Zappa's on the list. There he is. You'll all be happy now. There's Frank at number 3. All right, now my lists. I don't put bands on twice. Because if we were doing this, I'm a huge Frank Zappa fan. Once I open the doors to Frank Zappa, half of this list's Frank Zappa. The rest of it is John McLaughlin. There's a ton of Jan Hammer on there. The Prog's not getting a look in. That's what my list would be like. But at number 2, I've cheated here. I've cheated. Right, so at number 2, I have Visions of the Emerald Beyond by the Mavish Orchestra. And at number 1, I have The Inner Mountain Flame by the Mavish Orchestra. Okay? So let's talk about, to start off with, wrong hand, that one there, Visions of the Emerald Beyond. It's possibly my favourite album. I don't think it has the impact of Inner Mountain Flame in terms of just changing music history, in terms of progressive rock and jazz rock. It's the defining album, Inner Mountain Flame. But Visions of the Emerald Beyond, for me, it's a different band. It's an absolutely different band. It's when the Mavish Orchestra became an actual orchestra. It's John McLaughlin exploring the conjunction between rock, jazz and orchestral music. He really tried to do this and take the bull by its horns on Apocalypse, where he worked with George Martin, the London Symphony Orchestra, with great, Michael Tilson Thomas conducting. But what he learned from that was then put into this album here, Visions of the Emerald Beyond, which is a much smaller band, but it's still a large band. But between the sort of expanded rock band, the brass section, the string quartet, and then this sort of vocal choir that exists on there, you have the most expansive sound ever. Now, I think this is the reason why I did the list, because I think if I was truly making my 10 greatest progressive rock albums of all time, at number 1 I would have Visions of the Emerald Beyond. It is the greatest progressive rock album ever made, and it's the greatest jazz rock album ever made. That's what I would have. But I've stuck it at number 2 here. It's an album that I've done a whole video on. You can go and search it, and I've spoken for 20 minutes or half an hour on this album. The playing is incredible. The compositional ideas are just unbelievable. It's one of those albums you put on and you think, how the hell did they make this album? How do you go in the studio and make something like this? Because you drop that needle on the first track and it just opens up and it just goes and it does absolutely everything. And you think, how did they write this? Did they write it all separately, then put it together? Was it put it together afterwards, or was it conceived as one great big row? It's frightening. It's also one of the greatest sounding albums ever made. I've spoken about this album so much that I thought I've got to come up with a new little thing on here, and it's this. The other day I was listening to an interview with the great producer Trevor Horn. Trevor Horn defined the sound of the 80s with his production on the S9012 album, which I've mentioned earlier. He also produced ABC, Lexicon of Love. He also produced Frankie Goes to Hollywood. He defines the 80s sound. He pulls together those new wave post-punk influences and he combines them with progressive rock. And he's also made one of the most sort of catchiest hit records of all time, which is Video Killed the Radio Star, which actually sort of defines 80s music. He's a visionary, okay? And he was being interviewed on the radio the other day, mainstream radio. He sat there talking and he said, and someone asked him about his sound and his production, where it got from, and he said something like this, and I'm going to paraphrase him because I wasn't listening when he first started talking that heavily, but he said something like this: in the 70s there were incredible albums to listen to and it really influenced my production styles. For example, Visions of the Emerald Beyond by the Mavish Orchestra on mainstream radio, right? This album contains, right, Ralph Armstrong, that on the following album is going to create the vocal hook that's going to drive Unfinished Sympathy by Massive Attack, right? It contains on drums one of the greatest music producers of all time in Narada Michael Walden, who's going to come in, he's going to revitalise Aretha Franklin's career and then launch two of the biggest artists in history, Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston, right? Amongst a whole other glittering career that's involved movie soundtracks. It's all on this album. This is bigger than just a progressive rock album. It's bigger than a jazz rock album. Vision of the Album Beyond, which at the time was slated by the critics pretty much, is an utter masterpiece. But I've got it at number 2. So what have I got at number 1? The Inner Mountain Flame by the Mavish Orchestra. What pips this to the post? Well, I listened to the people who dropped comments on this. You know, when I did the video that launched this channel, 2 years ago, whenever it was, maybe 3 years ago now, which was my ranking of the Mavish Orchestra albums, I put Birds of Fire at number 1. That was because that's the album I first heard by the Mavish Orchestra. That was the one. That is a very, very important album to me. But it's true, and people are right. In a Mountain Flame is to jazz rock what In the Court of the Crimson King is to prog. Okay? It's also what the In the Court of the Crimson King is to prog. Right? In that, its influence on jazz rock is huge. Jazz rock changes when the Mavish Orchestra comes out. If you read influences with Yes and Genesis and all those musicians, there's a challenge when this band emerged, right? There's these progressive rock bands and they're really in there, you know, punching above their weight. They've taken rock music to another level. You know, the virtuosity and the brilliance of their arrangements and the musical visions here. Right, and they're there 1970-71 leading the way in terms of rock music, and then the Mavish Orchestra comes in here like this, and it just creates a new standard for instrumental virtuosity that to this day hasn't really been beaten. Right, but in terms of jazz rock as a genre, this is where it's invented. I've done this channel for a number of years now. I have explored the roots of jazz rock. And what we have is a lot of bands sort of, it's not like King Crimson where they can say there's a different band there that create the style at that moment. That's a really important moment. Everyone's experimenting with jazz rock and none of it quite works. Right, the elements are in, that's quite good. You know, Jack Johnson, it's sort of there, you know, but it's a sort of bluesy shuffle and it's got some solos on. It's, you know, all that sort of machine gun drumming and, you know, incredibly fast guitaring and the unison runs, the bass mirroring the keyboards, all this stuff that we would expect from jazz rock isn't on any of these albums. And yet In a Mountain Flame comes in and bang, it does it. And the difference for me between In a Mountain Flame and In the Court of the Crimson King is it delivers. Every one of these tracks is an utter masterpiece. And it's delivered in a way which we never really hear again, because this album is as much punk as it is rock. I love that, you know, quote from John Scofield, which I'll paraphrase because I can't remember exactly, but he said something like, his punk was at 280 BPM and was in 2116 or whatever that he said. And it's true. There's a brutality. That brutality and that sort of blood on the stage approach is there with the Tony Williams Lifetime, especially on Emergency. I'm thinking of doing a video just on Emergency. I think I have to deal with the Tony Williams Lifetime and I have to discuss that album. I've got to explain what makes it different from Turn It Over, which is another great album. But this very special place that album occupies in the history of music and especially jazz rock. So that is a precursor. But anyone who's listened to Tony Williams' Lifetime knows that what's going on this album when you put it on is something else. It goes through the roof. So that's what I've got at number 1. So I'm going to recap this because it's a long list, so you can sit back and see what I think of the 20 greatest or my 20 favourites. I don't know. We're somewhere between the two of those. But just because more people will click on it, if you allow me that, 'cause we want people to watch the channel, don't we? So I'm going to call it the 20 greatest jazz, rock and prog albums of all time. Would be at number 20, Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. At number 19, Per and Amico by PFM. At number 18, Exhibition by John Serry Jr. At number 17, we have UK, the self-titled debut album by UK. At number 16, we have In a Glass House by Gentle Giant. At number 15, we have You by Gong. At number 14, we have Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. At number 13, we have Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. At number 12, we've got Romantic Warrior by Return to Forever. At number 11, we've got Moving Pictures by Rush. At number 10, we've got Sing to God by Cardiacs. At number 9, Black Market by Weather Report. At number 8, Red by King Crimson. At number 7, Melodies by Jan Hammer. That's going to upset people. At number 6, Close to the Edge by Yes. At number 5, Crosswinds by Billy Cobham. That'll upset people. At number 4, Wired by Jeff Beck. Might do, but he's just died, so they might let me off. At number 3, One Size Fits All. At number 2, Visions of the Emerald Beyond by the Mavish Orchestra. One Size Fits All by Frank Zappa. You all know that. At number 1, The Inner Mountain Flame How many years have I been doing that channel? And I think here we are. I'm finally admitting to everybody that In the Inner Mountain Flame is the most important album ever made. Surely it is. Anyway, God, this is a long video. Hour and 10 minutes. God, how many people have stuck this to the end? Right, so if you've made it to the end, I now talk about something off the top of my head, and then you can mention it in the channel, and I know you've made it to the end, and then I know you are the true fans of this channel. Right, and what I'm going to mention now is Vangelis. I've never spoken about Vangelis on the channel, right? I'm not a fan of Aphrodite's Child. I'm not. If you watch the videos that came out last Friday, I put them in the sort of 10 greatest prog albums. I've gone back and listened to Heaven and Hell. You know, not Black Sabbath. I've gone back and listened to that too. That's a great album as well. Warren James here, what a singer. And a return to form for Black Sabbath. Who'd have thought it? But let's not talk about Black Sabbath. My computer keeps going to fall on the floor. Let's talk about Vangelis and Heaven and Hell. Is that truly one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made? Is it just not ever mentioned? Go back and listen to it. It's its own world, right? So, if you've made it to the end, give us the comments about Vangelis, Heaven and Hell. And that's for the prog fans. There we go. I've put a little bit of prog in the end for you. A little bit that we can have a discussion about Vangelis for the prog fans. Because they got probably really upset that my top 5 are jazz rock albums. But in the end, it's all prog. Everything's prog. Open your arms to the world and just let it all in. And realise that prog occupies the aesthetic centre of our creative vision of mankind in the past century. And what it's done is it's created a thing called prog. Right, and what prog is just normal people elevating themselves up to greatness, to the wonders of art, unlimited, not bound in by political parties, not bound in by religious dogma or ideology, not bound in by gatekeepers who want to tie everything down. It's the normal person. It's not high art. Prog is not high art. It's not what the rich people like. It's not what the elites try and hold on to. It's not grand opera. It's not classical music. It's normal people, just normal people, working normal people, opening themselves up to the great world of creativity and not being hemmed in. And when the powers that be see that, they come along and say, you've got to stop them. You've got to pull them down. It's all progressive. It's all progressive, right? Every time an artist elevates themselves up and goes, I'm going to make something conceptual, I'm going to make something that's got a storyline, and tries to explain something that's deep and meaningful and tries to affect people in a deep way, not just a casual throwaway bit of popular, tat, right? That's what prog is. And jazz rock is prog, okay? And so much music's out there prog. When popular music tries to elevate itself beyond the shallow conventions that have been thrust upon it by a commercial world, every time an artist tries to do that, it's prog. I'm glad I said that. I didn't think I was going to come up with something that good. That's summed up my channel. I feel like I've said something worthwhile at the end of that. I might cut that bit out and stick it on as a separate video. I can stick it on Instagram, can't I? Right, this could well be the longest video I've ever made. We're up at an hour and 13 minutes. I don't know, I can't remember. There's so many videos now. I must have gone over that now. And I am just rambling. So, if you've made it this far, tell me something about Vangelis. Click the like button. Subscribe. Click the notification bell. And most importantly, please, if you love what I do, come and support me over at Patreon. You won't be let down. You won't be let down, right? There's a whole ton of stuff there, and we have a lot of laughs and a lot of fun over there. So come on over and join all the guys over at Patreon. There's quite a few of us now, and I enjoy it very much. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching. It's going dark now. How long have I been in here? What month is it? What year is it? I can't remember. Right, I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.